There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sharia Away Book Club. Today, we're going to be holding space to discuss chapter 30, which is titled Harmony, in the third section of the book, which is titled The Mysticism of Sound. So, I have some notes to lightly guide this conversation if we need it, but I just kind of want to hold space first and before we even talk about the book, just kind of preface this discussion with asking y'all, when you think of the word harmony, what are a few concepts and ideas that come to mind for you? So I'm curious, when you think of harmony, is it like an embodied process? Is it like something that you think about when it just comes to music? Or is harmony something that kind of guides? Because I feel like in this chapter, Hazrat and Yakan is talking about a harmony that exists in a spiritual state, or a harmony that is the result of spiritual work. And so I know that that's not the first thing that everyone thinks of. So I want to hold space. I'm going to mute for a second because there's a train passing, but it's only going to be passing for 30 seconds. Okay. Thanks for y'all's patience. I'm going to read out some of the responses in the chat. Ahmed, hey Ahmed. Ahmed says, I think when it comes to harmony, I think of the state of accordance. Accordance. I like that word. Nobu writes, what comes to mind right now is, quote, differentiation without conflict. Ashe. Differentiation without conflict. I dig that. Tiff says, when notes sound good together, and, almost lost it. When notes sound good together, and the idea of vibing with a person or a group. Yeah, I really like you guys' responses. And it feels like there can be, there's some chat in the chat about the Honda Accord, Ashe. Trying to think of what my first car was. Oh, it was the Nissan Maxima. I had a gold Nissan Maxima, was my first car. Nissan Altima for you too, Ahmed. Ashe. Very appropriate. I'm curious what you guys' first car was. Nobu says my first car was a Prelude. I'm not sure I know what that brand is. Ahmed says a Hood Classic. While this really loud train passes by. Dodge Caravan. A Tiff was picking us all up with that one. Yeah, soccer mom van. Very reliable car. I think one of my parents had a Caravan as well. It's interesting that we're talking about cars right now, not to be too meta about this, but I often think about vehicles as modern day chariots. So yeah, and I think cars add to the harmony of people's lives, some people who need them, that is. Yeah, so kind of to like bring us to the text, I'm curious if there's anything from the first, because this was a longer chapter than we've read in a while. And I'm curious if there are any passages that stand out to you all. I have a passage in mind as well, but I want to hold space and see what you guys were drawn to upon reading this chapter.
One of the beginning of chapter 3, where he basically talks about how there's like he presents it as like diametrically opposed, right? About like veering towards the infinite versus veering towards manifestation. And it's funny because I remember just like a conversation that I actually had in the room. I think it was like some money chat or something like that, where I was just talking about how, because I think I'm thinking along the same lines as hazrat and Khan is over here, of like, to me manifestation really, when you really want something, you're fighting hard for it. It also like makes you question in a case of like, maybe a lack of acceptance of the current state, which is why you're pushing for that change, striving for that change, which kind of sits uncomfortable to me. But I can tell that maybe this is a me problem because I also don't feel like that is like the most regulated take as well. We all have desires. A desire for goodness is still a desire. You know what I mean? So and when you think about chapter 2 and he starts talking about vibrations and about like the mental plane and all that, um, wouldn't the desire for anything then be considered a manifestation, which he then sees as kind of opposed towards and kind of like, looks like kind of derogatorily as opposed to just seeking, combining towards the infinite. So let's just get y'all's thoughts on that.
Mhm. Yeah, I want to ask the question that Nobu asked in the chat if you could direct us to the section, if there was a section in particular, because I
Oh yeah,
also.
I saw it. It's like the fourth paragraph at page 130. It's fourth paragraph of chapter 130. Well, I can read it out loud real quick.
Oh, okay, you're taking a
Um,
pic. Yeah, please do. I'm gonna
yeah,
mute.
there are three. I'll just read a little paragraph before that, so you just get some context. There are three aspects of harmony: eternal, universal, and individual. Eternal harmony is a harmony of consciousness. As is in itself eternal, all things and beings live and move in it. Yet it remains remote, undisturbed, and peaceful. This is the God of the believer and the God of the knower. All vibrations, from the finest to the grossest, as well as each atom of manifestation, are held together by this harmony. Both creation and destruction take place in order to uphold it. Its power ultimately attracts each being towards the everlasting peace. Man is drawn in two opposite directions by the power of harmony, towards the infinite and towards manifestation. He is less conscious of the former than of the latter, and by facing towards one direction he loses sight of the other. The infinite being, the essential spirit of all, finally attracts all to itself. The Sufi gives the greatest importance to harmony with the infinite, which he realizes through resignation to the will of God the Beloved. The existence of land and water, the land for the water, and the water for the land, the attraction between the heavens and the earth, all demonstrate universal harmony.
Thank you, Ahmed, for reading that part out loud. Um, yeah, and can you also ask your question again, even if you want to ask it in the chat? But yes, this is actually exactly where I wanted to go. This idea that harmony begets manifestation, or harmony begets this connection with the infinite. Um, and it's interesting because he actually, like Hazrat Inayat Khan uses the word I think it's yes, how Sufis, he mentions how Sufis give great importance to the attainment of harmony, which I never thought of as something that you could attain. But again, we're kind of like working within this like spiritual metaphysical context. So yeah, I'm gonna read the chat real quick to see if you ask your question again. And I'm also holding space. What do you guys make of this idea or this dichotomy being presented about harmony in the sense of manifestation or drawing us nearer to manifestation, or harmony drawing one nearer to their connection with the infinite? And how does one reconcile that?
I guess like what I was picking up from what Ahmed said earlier, if I tune back into that space and time, was the sort of I'll call it I'll name it as my interpretation that there was some resistance to an interpretation of what Hazrat Inayat Khan was saying about sort of like the soullessness of manifestation. And I feel like my reading of it is like when we manifest without being connected to the infinite, then we manifest things which perhaps could be called like chaotic or non-harmonious.
And that makes sense, Nobu, because I was also talking about how does he connect this idea of if he sees manifestation as kind of less than, sort of harmony towards the infinite, how does that jive with what he said in chapter 2? But what you said, corresponds to that, right? It's not necessarily, it aligns with it. So I like that read.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about what he said in chapter 2, actually, because it was like, all of a week ago, which is ancient history, because of
Just
the
the
way that.
idea about vibrations. So it's not just about what you speak. So he does two things. He first talks about how, like, what we have in the mental world must be made of, there must be substrata in the mental world that, that is shared, um, just like how there's substrata in the physical world, right? We're composed of other beings inside of us and things inside of us, like bacteria and all that sort of stuff. And then he also talks about how sometimes these vibrations can be shared and how they are shared. So it's not just the word you speak, but sometimes the thoughts you held that can be shared and transmitted and all that sort of stuff. And within the soul as well. So all of that, so any desire for anything is an act of manifestation then. You know what I mean? According to him. I think you'd agree with that. So then my question was, I guess, so how does that work then? But what you said makes sense. It's all about, you come from that place of seeking the infinite, which is what you then desire, which is kind of, it all aligns.
Yeah, and I feel like, to bring this into accordance, to use a word that you brought in earlier, with other Abrahamic lineages, I would say that this is like, I think what lineages refer to when they say, when they talk about bringing heaven to earth, for me. I'm curious how that lands with y'all. Tiff says, I see it. That's very charitable. Thank you. I think I love what you brought in about what I'll call manifesting in non-physical realms as well. Because I think it's really important. Like if we're only thinking about, communing with the divine and then manifesting things in the material, then I feel like many people might miss out on what I think is like a core part of many lineages, Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic, which is that, our thoughts ultimately become material, right? So like, even if like you're not manifesting like, let's say, war in your matrix or in the surrounding matrix around you, but you're always like thinking about war, or I'm going to put some people on blast right now and say, if you're always playing like shooting games and you're thinking about shooting games, then I do feel like that leaves artifacts in collective metaphysical realms, which eventually contribute to the physical, right? Because you can imagine like, oh, all right, I'm not gonna like do any shooting in person, and then I'm gonna like do some shooting in my dreams and in my video games, and then somebody's gonna pick up your litter in the metaphysical, and then maybe they will like cause violence in their matrix or around their matrix,
Yeah, and I kind of want to like bring in the idea of law of attraction, which sometimes I think gets a bad rep because of how it's marketed. Um, and like these ideas of like, again, like using the power of manifestation to create material outcome only. And I think that that's what was strange for me, even with reading this chapter, like this idea of like attaining, um, these like metaphysical concepts. And I still feel like I'm reconciling it even as I speak about it now, but I'm like, it kind of makes me curious about this like underlying or like ever present reality that like shapes even things that are physical and spirit things that are physical. Um Nova says Abraham Hicks is in an Abrahamic lineage. Lord of mercy. The nuance and the layers. But yeah, I'm curious if there is, I almost lost it, if there is a thread of discussion there. Um if there's a I'm just laughing at the chat. If there's a thread of discussion and like how does like let's say like somebody who yeah, like cuz I'm like a modern day witch and I'm like doing like magic on the internet and so I kind of want to like go there and see how these principles of harmony that Hazrat Inayat Khan presents work within those confines for y'all at all or anyone who has a practice. I didn't mean to.
I guess I'll say now that I've gathered my hat, something that you and I have talked about in the broom, but also I think like in various places is just how like I think some of us have this practice of just like scrolling social media and like transmuting.
Mhm.
And I guess I wonder if you want to say more about how that practice works and how it relates to what we've been talking about.
Yes. Well, I think like offhand, like when there's so many things I want to say. I'm like, how shady do I want to be? But no, yes. This idea of like scrolling the timeline and then being like receiving like spiritual nudges from what I see and what I read. And not that the people who are saying anything on Twitter are like guiding me spiritually, but I will say that like often what I get a sense of when I'm online is like this sense of a collective. And the shady thing that I did want to say, which I'll bring back, is that I don't know if other people know that their like parasocial relationships are a sense of a collective, but I do. And so like with that, that is I feel like such a huge part of like my practice is like waking up, doing some kind of like embodiment, whether it's like singing or moving for like 15 minutes and then like pouring myself a cup of coffee, getting something to smoke, and scrolling a timeline and just transmuting mostly everything that comes up in my body, which actually for a long time I didn't consider a spiritual practice and didn't see as like a practice until I kind of just yeah, like just got confirmation, I guess you can say, from like my vaster self that I should probably keep going and like keep doing that. But it kind of connects to, I think, there's so many things that I want to bring up, but I think it connects to something I had also said in Adam's archetypal hour a couple weeks ago of this idea of attuning oneself against a circumstance and specifically a circumstance you can't control. And so that's kind of how I see social media. And I wonder if it occurs for y'all in the same way, like this uncontrolled environment that is like not very regulated, that is not very streamlined or cohesive, but it ends up being like almost like the perfect circumstance for me to find myself in and to do that attunement work. And I wonder if it occurs for y'all in that way as well. And if it's not online, what other circumstances you guys find yourself attuning yourself?
Yeah, that for me kind of resonates. Like I'll have like a wide variety of people on my timeline, and sometimes it's stuff I agree with, and sometimes not. And like I feel like a lot of the stuff I don't agree with will like trigger me in a way. Then I can like use that as a like a bouncing off board or something to like self reflect, like what's triggering about this, like why, and I can like figure out stuff about myself that I wasn't really thinking about. And like usually social media is kind of like too much all at once, but sometimes it's like the perfect time to just stumble upon something that might spark a evolution.
Yeah, that aligns for me as well, Tiff. And I feel like I also started reflecting a little bit on what you're saying about social media being too much sometimes, because I feel like I do most of like what I'll call like this kind of collective work on, say, Twitter or X as they call it now, or Threads, because I feel like with Instagram, so much of it tends to be more like branded or like mercantile in nature. So it's like not only is the stuff they're saying like triggering a lot of the time, but also it's presented in a way which is triggering to me. Because I feel like I would say like the unconscious like striving of so many accounts on Instagram gives it like that added, I'll say like disharmony. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you all speaking to that. And it actually kind of inspires me to want to read a section in the text. And so this is paragraph 13 in chapter 3. Um, and I'll read it. It goes, if people in their daily life would examine every action that has reflected a disagreeable picture of themselves upon their soul and caused darkness and dissatisfaction, and if, on the other hand, they would consciously watch each thought, word, or deed that has produced an inward love, harmony, and beauty, and each feeling that had brought them wisdom, calm, and peace, then the way of harmony between soul and body would be easily understood, and both aspects of life would be satisfied, the inner as well as the outer. The soul's satisfaction is much more important than that of the body, for it is more lasting. In this way, the thought, speech, and action can be adjusted so that harmony may be established first in the self by the attunement of body and soul. And that brings up quite a lot for me, but I wonder, I guess the reason why I was called to like read that section is because I think it reflects a lot of what you guys are saying and like how I'll kind of like delineate or like this will be like a little bit of a tangent where I'm like I often feel like the outsider in life. Like it's like tough to find places where I belong. Um, and with that, the reason why I mentioned that is because I feel like also like the way that I attune to energy is very different than most people do. And so even though Hazrat Inayat Khan presents this paragraph of like something that's like plausible, which gives me hope, and that's like possible, which gives me hope, I still find it very difficult to like navigate daily life because most people are like attuned to look at what they dislike or like find dissatisfaction and attuned to dissatisfaction and misery. And I'm almost like I am almost certain, but please disagree, that most people don't know that there's another way. But I also really love that the way that Hazrat Inayat Khan is presenting this dichotomy is something that's very, again, like shielding with the word attainable, right? But it feels like attainable in this paragraph. It feels attainable when we're bringing it into the scope of parasocial media. Because at the end of the day, what one thing that I love about that kind of like energy work, right, or energy attunement is that if it does ever get too much, I can turn my phone off and just kind of dedicate myself to my internal, right? And I can try again tomorrow if I'm very dedicated to like my practice and this idea of attaining harmony. But I also feel like it's very real. And it's I feel like I don't struggle often, but I feel like it's one of my struggles, in the sense of, yeah, the sobering recognition that not everybody is trying to attune to the harmony of the infinite, um, even though it seems paramount. So I'm I'm curious what either that passage brings up for y'all, or if what I'm saying either brings up anything for you guys.
I think there's a couple of things which it brings up for me. Like the first one is just like, like going back to the law of attraction, which, I think is only like partially explicated by Abraham Hicks and all that kind of stuff. But, like in the Tao Te Ching, they talk about how like water flows from the high places to the low places. And I think if you are a practitioner who's cultivating harmony, then what tends to happen in, I'll say, like free-flowing circumstances, like life outside of parasocial media, is that you attract disharmony. And yeah, please disagree as always, right? But I would say that if I'm just like walking around in the street and I'm embodying harmony, cultivating the radiance of my spirit, then I often find myself called to move towards, or I'll say unconscious energy moves people towards me so that, what I will call my harmony ends up, yeah, I guess like often coming into possible encounters of conflict with what other people might call their harmony. I think is like an interesting frame. But yeah, I'm curious if that aligns for y'all. And then I think, in those encounters, I would say that often I feel called to harmonize the disharmony. Whereas I would say in parasocial media, which is a more, let's say, like algorithmically attuned space, I think most of these social media algorithms or parasocial media algorithms basically optimize for engagement, right? And I think people engage in different ways. So some people may be conditioned to only engage with things that they find harmonious, right? Which is how you get like filter bubbles. But then I think also other people feel called to engage with things that trigger them or conflict with their belief systems. So they end up like, like quote tweeting or replying to things that they find triggering or conflicting. And then the algorithm's like, oh, okay, so you like to engage with things that you disagree with. So then some people get more of what they disagree with. Whereas I'd say generally in person, we're probably going to find things, if we're following intuition, at least in my experience, that is polarizing to us.
Totally. And I'm kind of glad you spoke to this like other option or this other possibility of, well, I won't even say it's a possibility because I feel like it happens for me often where I'm just feeling on top of the world in my radiance, as you said. And often I am called into like disharmonious circumstances, or like I'm in a store that's like completely empty and then it fills up with all these people who are like in a rush and their energy is like, even if they're not like directly disharmonizing like my feel, it's like they're like just so buzzy and in a rush. And I'm like, dang, I was like sitting on top of the world, man. Like they just came in here and like, yes, yeah, people, oh my God, I've had even clerks tell me that, like, you brought the crowd. And I'm like, I swear I didn't mean to. And so, yeah, I'm really glad that you spoke to that there's, yeah, like a harmonizing affect that can be co-created, like even though things that are deemed as disharmonious or disagreeable enter our field. And that it can even, I mean, I know we talk about this in a lot, but I feel like it can even be fertile training ground to like refine and like not like numb out the things that like dysregulate you, but like to get better at like walking through those different, I'll say like landmines where disharmony could be like the way that a situation remains, it's like having that skill feels like it's super transferable in those circumstances to me.
100. And I guess I feel called to break it down even like further, right? Like, I won't say that like in my self-conceptualizing mind, I often seek out disharmony because, like most people, I'd say I find harmony most regulating, right? But I'd say like, yeah, sometimes I feel like I'm called into circumstances where I'll encounter disharmony so that I can find things in my field which can be released. And then
Hmm.
B, often I feel called to disharmonious encounters so that I can help to harmonize what's going on in other people's fields or in the field of other people. But I guess like the other part of that, which I think speaks to what you're saying, is like sometimes, you may be moved to go to a place and just be in your radiance, and then other people's like unconscious energy will guide them towards you, right? And I kind of reminded of something that Kensu Neferhotep used to say, which is that, well, he was talking about people who were born on Fridays, which I would say within the logos of the born days lineage, um, they'd say that people who are born on Fridays are like natural exorcists, which for me makes sense as like Venusian energy is often associated with cultivating one's own radiance. But what he used to say is that like demons often come for people who are born on Fridays. So people who are born on Fridays have to watch out for like addiction. Addiction is like a demon in that lineage and also in the lineages. And the reason that demons come for people who are naturally born exorcists because they want to like dim their radiance, right? So that they can't exercise other demons. And I would say that maybe one school of thought would be, well, like, shouldn't exorcists sort of stop other people from coming towards to dim their radiance? But I don't think that this is aligned with like a general principle of sovereignty, right? So in my experience as an exorcist, I would say that it's more common for me to help people to release things, which maybe sometimes causes other things come to the surface, which would cause them to come at me. So those things can be released, right? But I think it's, I think like even just what I'm saying now is probably speaking to what I was saying before about how I think like the law of attraction and the law of Abraham Hicks, like overly simplified.
Totally. And I'm glad that you spoke to that. I was just thinking of how I was like raised by people who were born on Friday and how yeah, that really aligns for me. Um and also, gosh, there's so many things that I want to say, but I'm gonna hold just a little bit more space.
Yeah, I'll also say that I understand why like the law of Abraham Hicks has gotten so much traction because it is much simpler. Like,
Hmm.
I was just
Yeah,
like
that's
I was looking at a graph of what I said, and it's like a tree, whereas like I think the law of Abraham Hicks is very much like a straight line.
yeah. I was like, it's very linear. I think it also has this aspect of being linear so that people can keep coming back as opposed to like getting to the roots and almost like the leaves of what you were saying, which is like I think liberates people from like this cycle of like constantly chasing an affect, chasing an outcome, as opposed to just like refining just because refining actually feels good and it's like hygienic. Um, and that, I mean, even exorcism feels good. Um, it feels hygienic. As somebody who does it, I'm like, um, often like shocked at how much comes to the surface when I'm doing that kind of work. And at the same time, I like kind of like sit back and I'm like proud because I'm again like to go back to the text a little bit, I'm like I'm attuned to harmony because I want to be connected to the infinite, not because I'm only looking for specific outcomes. And I think a lot of people are starting to feel that way because they can kind of see how baseless the law of attraction is, in the sense that it like really struggles to like root people into either like a lineage, or root people into a path, or root people into a way that they can change their lives, from like, without sounding corny, from like inside out. um I think the law of attraction is kind of, it's also slippery because it's about creating this like perfect environment to manifest this greater self. And to me, I'm like, the greater self is already there. Like, we're born with that greater self, in my opinion. And it's about actualizing that self through embodiment, and not through like more, not, again, this is like a not non-material kind of like rant, but not through like more things, or by like fooling oneself. I think Hazrat Inayat Khan even speaks to it, how it's like, um, the individual ego is an illusion. It's an interface to like relate to the world. So to hinge your connection with the divine, in my opinion, on that ego self, is a surefire way to generate like dissatisfaction, misery, disharmony. Um, and not to say that it doesn't happen even when you're practicing. I just think that it's like, yeah, it's a very linear path, in my opinion. And I wonder what, yeah, I wonder what that brings up for y'all. Mm, I'm gonna read the chat. Nobu says, I feel like that speaks to something you said in field tuning a couple of weeks ago, maybe about manifesting from the divine versus manifesting from the ego and fumbling. Definitely. And I think it's actually what I was the most excited to talk about. Today is the nafs. And I wanted to share an image in the chat of the nafs, which in um, some Islamic and some Sufi lore, the nafs basically um, comes down to, so the nafs is an Arabic word occurring in the Quran, literally meaning the self, and has been translated as psyche, ego, or soul. The term cognate with the Hebrew word nefesh. In the Quran, the word nafs is used in both individualistic and the collective sense, indicating that although humanity is united in possessing the positive qualities of the nafs, they are individually responsible for exercising the agencies of the free will that the nafs provides them. And so I'm going to share that in the chat along with this really cool image that's kind of like oh yeah, that was really beautiful. Nobu's talking about the nafs of birds. Yes, y'all feel free to unmute if there was any part about on a text about nafs that stood out to y'all.
Well, I guess I've been like meditating. He talks about the nafs of like lions and how they kind of just like get into fights all the time. And then the nafs of birds, which I think he related mostly to like nesting and providing for their young. And, of course, like what I went to is like the visions I've had of the realm 1111, the realm of Ma'at, or what we call Andromeda in our space time, where I've seen, like our soul complex uses like flocks of birds, which are also cats, which I feel like in some ways like a symbolic representation of the combination of those nuts, right? Like there are these birds who mostly eat fruit, which are offered from trees in exchange, where, the pollinator is getting nutrition so they can continue pollinating. And then, of course, like most birds will like eat the fruit and then they're going to poop it out. There's going to be seeds going everywhere else. So the plant which bears the fruit in that exchange is getting the proliferation of its genetic code to places that it can't reach because it's immobile. So there's like that nafs or nafs or nefesh. But like also there's the nefesh, I'll say, of like being willing to fight, right? Which reminds me of this characterization of Sekhmet as protector of divine will. Where, I think like if you look in our realm, there are like birds of prey, which you could say are like more cat-like. They tend to get into fights. But there are also birds which focus more exclusively on like pollinating and taking care of the young. And I would say they're more likely to be endangered in our realm because of the interference with species which have like nafs, which I'll say are probably more oriented towards conflict and violence.
Yeah, thank you for reflecting, Nobu. Yeah, because it's making me think of the first time I learned of nafs and how like there was this similar to this chart that I offered in the chat from Wiki. It's not I didn't make it, but anyways, it makes me think about how there are different iterations of the nafs and like how the nafs undergoes, and this is like especially in like Sufi esoteric Islamic lineages that really speaks to how the nafs can be cultivated alongside the like spiritual impulse of the individual. And so yeah, I did want to bring that into the chat. And um, something else, but it's slipping my mind right now. I think I just kind of want to hold space and see what other people made of that action in the book about the nafs of birds, the nafs of lions. I also feel like what Nobu said about the realm of Andromeda really aligns for me. And in my experience, I've definitely felt and seen and connected to like different interdimensional, higher dimensional beings that will literally like morph in between bird and like lion. And I guess like at the first level, oh yeah, that's the thing that I wanted to say. Like when I first learned about nafs, I was like, oh, is this the anima? But it's a very different way that especially after reading this chapter, I'm like, oh, I understood and re-understood the nafs in a completely different way. And I think I kind of was able to decouple it from this idea that it's the anima. And so I'm glad that we're kind of talking about this because this is also helping me like fill in some of that space for myself. Nobu says this conflation of psyche, ego, and soul is very interesting to me. What do y'all make of that? That the nafs has all of that in it. Or is presented in that way. I guess it brings me to one of the paragraphs, paragraph 18. And it reads, every human being has an attribute peculiar to their nafs. One is tiger-like, another resembles a dog, while a third may be like a cat and a fourth like a fox. In this way, people shows in their speech, their thoughts, their feelings, the beasts and the birds, and the condition of their nafs is akin to their nature, and at times their very appearance resembles them. Therefore, their tendency to harmony depends upon the evolution of their nafs. As people begin to see clearly through the human life, the world begins to appear as a forest to them, filled with wild animals fighting, killing, and preying upon one another. Oh, okay. And then I'll read the next paragraph where he says there are 4 different classes of people who harmonize with each other in accordance with their different states of evolution, which I did not agree with, but he says the different states of evolution are angelic, human, animal, and devilish. So I'm curious what you guys make of that categorization.
I feel like I dropped the etymology of nafs in the chat, which in the Hebrew is like, well, actually it comes from the Akkadian, which is to breathe, which like for me, I'll say evokes like the transient psyche, not so much like what I would call the soul. And I think in the Wikipedia article that you dropped, it says literally the self, which I think also aligns with what I'm saying about like the psyche or the transient self. And yeah, I think to break it up into like this hierarchy of like the angelic and like the devilish, I think speaks to a little bit of like conditioning within our realm from my perspective. But I think like what's really useful for me and the way that I'm called to like experience different layers of selfhood through my direct experience of the divine. And I think this aligns also with like East Asian folk traditions, I'll say, is that there's this idea of like the corporeal soul, which is like a selfhood which emanates from our earth ancestry. And then there's the idea of the etheric soul, which is like a self which emanates from our connection to, I'll say, like genetic code that manifests at like a metaphysical or like a vaster level, and is often presented as like nativity in astrology. And then in between those things, there is like the Shen, like the spirit, which I think some people translate as like the mind, which emanates from the heart. And I don't want to get too much into that, but I would say that like this is like the correlate to nafs, at least in East Asian folk medicine. And yeah, I'd say it's transient, and it sort of arises from the personal experiences that we have and the degree to which we are able to integrate our personal experience into a unified self. And I would say that our personal experience arises from, you could say, like the orchestration, which arises from the corporeal soul and the etheric soul, right? So it's like there's this like timeless soul, which is like outside of, I would say, our earthly lineages, outside of our personal incarnations, which I would say is always informing our experience, and also, if we're connected to it, being informed by our experience. And I'd say the same happens for our corporeal soul. But often we integrate polarities between our etheric souls and our corporeal souls, right? So sometimes we're moved towards things by the karma of our etheric souls, and sometimes we're moved towards experiences by the karma of our corporeal souls. And what happens in between is our experience. And then I would say, like, when we integrate our experience, then we can harmonize between our earth ancestors and our sky ancestors, or our corporeal souls and our etheric souls. And also we can integrate all of our personal experiences as a kind of bridge between those souls. And I would say, like, to go back to what you were saying before, when we are in harmony, then our likelihood of bringing heaven to earth is much higher. And I would say we also can build bridges for other nafs, like other psyches that we co-create with.
Ashe, Nobu. Thank you for really breaking down those mechanics too, because I feel like, especially when you got to the part where you were speaking to like bringing heaven to earth, I think that I was starting to feel like a question forming, like, okay, so like, what's the point in all this? And I'm like, yeah, like there has not only like the point in all this, but also like this idea of like where does this refinement take you or take anyone? And I feel like this felt sensation, because many people talk about new earth and like heaven and earth, and it's not a new idea, it's actually ancient, and it's something that I can, or that I find myself able to tap into. And I know many of you all probably tap into it too in meditative states, when I can grasp and have like a relational connection to these different aspects of my my whole self, and what these, like, not even like aspects of myself, but like these puzzle pieces that make up myself. And yeah, I was also reading the items, the etymology that you shared, and I really love that it this idea of nafs, or this etymological meaning of nafs, this root of nafs, relates to the breath, relates to life, relates to um the inhale and the exhale that we all take on this journey. And so it's, again, it's like actually very grounded to me in the way that you explain that, and also the way that you laid that out. Regarding like your lineages, like cosmology, I feel like there's so many intersections with mine as well. um and I also was feeling into this idea that, like, sometimes that there, because that these parts of my lineage that, like, where we like explain our cosmology, it's hard to like translate to English. I also really enjoyed hearing like the words that you found to give names and to give shapes to these aspects of the self. And I think that you call, what did you call it? You said like a transient psyche. That really stood out to me. I wonder if that brought up anything for anyone else.
Yeah, I feel like well, you asked anyone else as well, but there was something in the passage you read out which I felt like could be interpreted as somebody having like a nafs which is like immutable, right? Like not changeable or not transient. And I don't think that this was necessarily like Hazrat Inayat Khan's intention, but I do feel like it's transient. And, you know, I think like believing that people have a nafs which is like inherently, let's say, like combative or inherently conflict ridden or even like inherently placid or sedate,
Mm,
lends itself to sort of a nihilistic worldview in my experience. It's like, oh, people are people. You can't do anything to change people, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, I mean, I think in my direct experience, I've done a lot of things which hold space for people to change without coercing them towards change. And then I'll say also, to be like completely honest, there have been phases in my life where um, I've caused people to change in ways which were more forceful, right? And I don't think that led long term towards like integration and healing. But that's also my karma.
for sure. Yeah. Whoa. Whoa, what a transmission, bro. I wonder what that brings up for y'all. Do you guys think that people can't change? And I mean, even if you think that, I won't call you nihilistic, just because nobody thinks it's nihilistic. But I do agree. I also am thinking about the many times where well, not the many times, but the specific time that I referenced earlier where I first learned about nafs, and I like felt like that like kind of broke the glass ceiling of like evolution for my own self, because I kind of did grow up with this idea, and I don't think anybody taught it to me. It was really just conditioning. But I grew up with this idea that things were just immutable, like people were just never going to change. I was never going to change. And so to kind of discover at that time, at least, this like esoteric lens on a belief in a system that really like served me at that time, and see that like there's scripture that says that like people do change, and in fact that like part of what it means to be human is to change and evolve and have perceptual shifts, and relearn things and see things in another way. Like I mean, I like have chills right now because I quite literally remember like crying when I discovered this and being like, oh my God, like it just was like, those people who, people who have like coming to God moments. Like I have many coming to God moments in my life, but I had another coming to God moment in that moment where I was just like, oh my God, like I just felt seen. I'm like choking up now. Like I felt seen by the divine, and like just to see that there were not only like validations of just like that you can change, like the divine saying, and like all these scholars saying that like yes, God says that you can change. There's also parts of scripture and also like hadith and scholarly works about how there are pathways to change. Some of the lineage spaces that we have here in the broom, to me, are pathways to change. And so I'm reading the chat. And so I just kind of want to hold a little bit more space, and I guess, yeah, like see how you guys feel about that, this idea that we can change and that we can change direction on our path, change our intention on our path. We can be in circumstances. How do y'all feel about that? You can be more bird-like, you could be more lion-like. Does that lend to more liberation for you? And if so, why? Ahmed says, TVH, I don't think I ever even considered the idea that people can't change. Ashe. So I'm barking up the wrong tree, and this is not the audience for the question that I'm trying to bait y'all into. I see. No, but
I
that's, I
mean, I
mean, I
feel
think
like
that's great. Sorry. Go on.
no, yeah, like to Ahmed's point, I feel like whenever people have said things like or advanced arguments like, "Oh, you can't change people," like I tend to wrinkle my nose because I've seen people change, you know, and I've even seen people like switch between, I'll say like demons, like they'll switch between being like, shielding my mom into being like a banshee who's like claiming that things happened which I didn't experience, even though I was said to be in the containers in which those things happened. And like, that's less of, I think, like the kind of change that we tend to talk about in terms of refinement and integration. But, like it was always really clear to me that if somebody can go from being like a mom like mom to being like a hell like mom, then maybe the things that cause them to be like a hell like mom can either be opportunities for them to integrate and be less like a hell like mom, or there are things that, I can refine within myself so that I'm not causing the circumstances that cause that shift from my mom being a mom like mom to a hell like mom. Um, and that's just like a couple of different ways in which I feel like I've seen change manifest.
I feel like if someone speaks to me about, just not being able to change, I think like that would just cause introspection to me to wonder, like, what's giving them the sense of helplessness in their environment that feels that they can't actually go against the environment they're in to actually cause a change. Where's that hurt coming from?
Absolutely. Yeah, even before I started doing energy work and was a practitioner, like literally my friends knew me for asking them the question, "Who hurt you?" Like in a non-sarcastic way, because that's what that is. And I'm glad that you spoke to that, Ahmed, because I also feel like it actually fills in the colors for me a little bit about, do y'all hear this train? I'm gonna mute.
Yeah, to speak to Ahmed's point while the train's choo-chooing, I'll say, like in what I said in the chat in response to what Ahmed said, is like, like I feel like I've always been finely attuned to like things that move through people as unconscious energy. And what I said is, what's in them that makes them want to not change, and what is at stake in them? Like, if there is like you know, in my lineage, you call it a demon, but a lot of people don't like that word. But it's like, if there is a demon that makes them want to deny the possibility of change, like, why is that? Right? And I think, like, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that people can't change without picking up on that unconscious energy of what I would call like a demonic nature.
I'll say what's interesting is I always considered more of the environment, you know. What is it in the environment that makes it feel that way, as opposed to you just going directly to the heart of the matter, which is what you're doing of what makes you feel that way. I think I just try to look for like another external cause that then causes inner turmoil, as opposed to just looking at the inner turmoil itself. So that's interesting, and thanks for that.
Yeah, I definitely feel like it's both, but I also feel like, yeah, I'll say those of us who have been doing the inner work have also experienced how the way that we react or the way that we respond to external circumstances evolves as a result of the inner work, right? So, I think, yeah, for most people, like, external circumstances perhaps primal, or you could say that it causes a primal reaction. But, like, going back to what I was saying about bringing heaven to earth, and how, for me, it involves building bridges so that people can perhaps optionally cross those bridges into realms of refinement and integration. Um, doesn't necessarily mean that, like, what I bring to earth from what I call heaven always causes peace for people, right? Because I think if we're only creating peaceful circumstances, or you could say like creating external circumstances for people where they don't react, then we don't give them opportunities to encounter their karma. And I would say that we don't also allow for the release of the karma that we might have, which sometimes causes us to want to only create peace for other people, right? I think, like, I've gone through like really long phases in my life where I could say, fixated on creating peace around me. And often that meant enabling people in codependent dynamics. And it often meant curtailing my own expression in order to please people. And ultimately, I'll say it didn't work, right? Like, those people still had those triggers, and external circumstances eventually arose in which they got triggered. And then I would say that repressing myself also led to being more easily triggered in other circumstances. So I think, like, for me, the best we can do is like create circumstances that give people the possibility of integration, but we can't, again, like, coerce people into crossing those bridges, in my experience.
Yeah, no, but thank you for speaking to that non-coercive part of, I think, that process. Um, I also want to read out something else you said in relation to this kind of work. In the chat earlier, you said, I feel like our psyches can change and our ancestries in earth and sky can change. Um, and I just was wondering, I mean, I know that that can happen because I've experienced that through working with you and other people in the room. But I just wanted to see if you wanted to like speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, I guess, like, I mean, first, I kind of want to read out something that Ahmed said in response to what I said earlier,
Yes.
which is like, give them the realization of agency without the guilt of their inaction. And I said in response, to be real, like, I don't feel like I give anybody guilt, like, for me, guilt's something that arises in someone's metaphysical self. And of course, like, we know that, people talk about guilt tripping. So I feel like there is like collective recognition of the idea that there can be behavior which is intended towards causing people guilt. and coming from like experience of knowing what causes people to feel guilty. But I would say if I'm like just embodying my authentic expression, like sometimes people are going to feel guilty, right? Like, like I was at a dance hall party on Friday and I was just like dancing my ass off and like I was spinning around and I was like moving my hips and like I know people felt weird about it, but it's like, am I not allowed to dance? Like, am I not allowed to like fully express myself? I don't feel like that is aligned so much with like what I was calling before, like a principle of non-coercion. Um, but yeah, I guess like before I'd said, what was it that you read out? I feel like our psyches can change and our ancestries in Earth and sky can change. Yeah, I mean, like, when people talk about ancestral healing, I feel like that's an example where, you know, we're calling in the energies of our ancestors. And sometimes the energies of our ancestors can be like, um, they can guide us towards peaceful circumstances. But I think, again, like if we're only calling in those parts of our ancestors which are helpful to us, then there's so much opportunity, there's so much like value that's left on the table. I mean, I think if you want to talk about ascension, I think there's a lot of stuff that we have to call in from our ancestors and not necessarily like manifest, but I would say like at least hold and harmonize and like view with compassion so that our ancestors can ascend and so that the guidance that we can receive from them is like that much richer and that much more attuned to current time. And I would say the same goes for like the karma of our sky ancestors, or what sometimes people call like higher self. It's like, I think like there is this egregore in New Age spiritual circles, which sort of, um, people attach to, which is that like if they're embodying their higher self, then there's nothing they do which can be misaligned, right? And I think we've seen people, let's say in like spiritual Twitter saying like, I am an enlightened being, there is nothing that I could do which is possibly inappropriate. But I think like, one of my earlier teachers once said that, people seek spirituality because they think that like material life is too complicated. And she was like that's foolish because spiritual life is just like 10 times, 20 times more complicated than material life. And I agree, because I think to believe that like our higher self is completely at peace with other people's higher selves is also kind of a cope, right? I think like there are many cosmic beings, there are many star beings, and I would say that we have ancestors that belong to the bodies of many different star beings, um, and they're not always in harmony. And I think this aligns with some teachings which talk about how Earth is also sort of like a negotiating table where we can like resolve some of the karma of conflict of our sky ancestors. And I think it also aligns with the way that people talk about how different lineages came to Earth so that they could resolve some of their karma. And like, what I sometimes like to think of this like as this like game or this theater of life.
Thank you for dropping that lore. That was super special for me. And I really appreciate you speaking to, like, we're speaking, I feel like this container has been juiced with like this possibility that change is possible. And then so like deepen that octave of change and then also raise it up to include like our sky and earth ancestors, to me just feels incredibly comprehensive. And it also reminds me of a tweet or a thread that I saw recently about how someone was expressing how it's important to work with your ancestors. And in this context in particular, they were speaking to how some of their ancestors were coming to them in regards to kind of this dissonance in their ancestral line that related to um, the afterlife or the presupposed afterlife looking different than their ancestors were told, probably through like conditioning or like religious programming. And I remember after seeing that, just like sitting for a while with my hand on my heart and just like kind of remembering and like feeling the echoes of like some of the work that we get to do in the room, which is like kind of update the metaphysical technology that our ancestors have at their disposal is how it's how sometimes I like to see it myself personally. And like sometimes without getting too like fluffy about it, I do feel like sometimes when I'm doing the work, I'm like imparting that wisdom and that crystallinity to my ancestors who had like no practice. Like I remember early on in my ancestral practice, like those were the ones that I actually wanted to, like those ancestors who were like despirited, like unharmonized, abused, harmed, not at rest. Like those were the ones that were coming to me first, which I think aligns because you know how we were speaking to earlier, like creating and attuning harmony in yourself kind of makes you a lighthouse to disharmonious energies. And I'm like so grateful that it was my ancestors and not just like birds attacking me in the park or something. Um, so yeah, I really appreciate that like refined perspective on refinement through the myriad of ancestors that we have, and also this idea too, or this sense I would say of Earth being like a round table for this give Earth being a round table. I want to kind of just leave that in the air and wonder if that wonder what that brings up for you all. I want to read what Nobu said in the chat. Oh, sorry, I saw Nobu unmuted. Please speak to it.
Yeah, I loved what you said about like feeling called to work with unhealed ancestors, or like you used the word despirited ancestors, and I think to me that speaks very much to this like ascension piece, right? I guess I'm just gonna like trot out some of my most unhinged nuances, but like I've often talked about the moon as a
Mhm.
repository of unhealed ancestral karma, and some stuff's been coming up in the broom recently with relation to Gurdjieff and Uspensky's law about
Mm,
the moon being like, I'll say, like an astral body that we feed with human energy. And Anna was like, "Oh, that sounds like the moon's vampiric," and I was like, "Not untrue." But yeah, what I'd
right.
said in the chat was like, like we can call in only our healed ancestors, and like we can make our lives fairly comfortable, or at least you could say like in accordance with how they led comfortable lives. But
Mhm.
I think, we also have these spirited ancestors, and I feel like they also deserve to ascend and contribute their experience to the greater cosmos, and not just like the space time of the earth and moon. But also, like, I think we all have relatives who are just like, like they're not working consciously with ancestral energies, but I would say that they're often unconsciously calling in unhealed ancestry. So,
Mm,
like you could have this situation where like you're just like working with healed ancestors and your life's kind of comfortable within like a certain set of parameters. But if you are also in proximity to like living relatives and they're unconsciously calling in unhealed ancestry, then like that sucks if you care about your family because you just watch them like wreaking havoc in their lives. And then I would say also, if you do have lives which are in proximity to your living ancestors or your living relatives, then it's pretty hard to stay comfortable if you have a heart while you're
right.
watching unhealed living relatives just like suffer. And then also, of course, like they often tend to draw us into like their karmic games, right? So
Mhm.
I think like working with our unhealed ancestors also helps them, and it also helps us, and it also helps these like despirited ancestors. And I would say, you know, the long game is that the moon becomes a protector again, and not
Mm,
just like an energy which tends to be vampiric. And I guess like to speak to the vampiric nature of the moon, I think we all I think it's like pretty common knowledge, even amongst people who don't count themselves as mystics, that like when the moon is full, people do crazy shit, right? Like there's more
mhm.
accidents, there's more activity in emergency rooms, and I feel like most people would be hard pressed to say that that activity is cosmic. I would also say that people perform a lot of unconscious sex magic in accordance with the cycles of the moon, which in my experience leads to cycles of like romantic attachment and ultimately rupture between people,
Mhm.
which could be called vampiric.
Which I feel like it is, honestly. I feel like it's becoming more commonplace too, in like even circles that are not based in ascension lore, to speak to like the moon as like a satellite for human consciousness, or like this reflector. And there's so many different ways that people talk about the moon, but it influences us. And I think that if there is some sort of like cosmic orchestration that we internally have a sense of, in my opinion, then yeah, I can definitely see the moon having this more generative, reflective relationship with humanity, as opposed to this, yeah, like vampiric siphoning type of relationship. Um, I'm gonna read what Ahmed said in the chat. It's funny because the moon is also a big reason for why life is thriving on Earth. A symbiotic relationship, definitely, definitely.
Yeah, and I think like it would be accurate for me to speak to the moon like over a vaster span of time. Like in my nearest, like the moon has only been like sort of oriented towards vampirism. And you know, like it varies based on people's life and like the ancestral karma that they're dealing with within this lifetime, right? Um, but yeah, I think there was a time when the moon was a protector, and I think this is backed up by what people are discovering about the interactions between magnetic flux in the
Mm,
interplanetary medium, or the solar plane, as I call it, and the moon as like a shield, and also
mhm,
like Earth has its own magnetic field, which is a shield. But I would say like, you know, like when people talk about the fall, I would say for me it relates to the infiltration of Earth with law, which led us to this like spiral of producing ancestral karma, so that the moon went from being a protective element, or you could say like a filter for the energies that come in from the sun and from the other planets which interact with the sun,
mm,
towards being sort of like an amplifier, right? So like now I'd say like often when there is magnetic activity in the solar plane, it tends to kick up ancestral trauma, which is like, you know, when there is, you know, like there's like a coronal mass eruption,
mm,
and then that causes resonance in Earth's core, and then that causes fluctuations in Schumann resonances. I would say like people tend to experience like erratic behavior or like
mhm,
bodily pain. Whereas I
mhm,
feel like there was probably a time when that kind of stuff happened and it just sort of like amplified, or it was filtered through um, the geomagnetic field of the Earth, and also shielded by the moon to an extent.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, like to Ahmed's point that like the moon is also a big reason for why life is thriving on Earth. I would say, is life thriving on Earth?
mm,
Like if you look at like life, let's say since like the 70s, I think, you know, some of the figures say that like 70 to 80% of the intelligence of Earth, which I would call like the genetic code of Earth, or like 70 to 80% of the species on Earth have become endangered or extinct. But yes, I think like originally, like the moon's obviously been around for much longer than like the 70s. Um, and I would say that, um, yeah, the influence of the moon was absolutely like, I will say seminal, um, to the development of the intelligence of Earth.
sure. Yeah, as you were speaking to like solar flares and like how the moon used to, or at some point can return to being a shield for some of those magnetic fluxes, like something in my back went crick crack, and I've been I feel like that movement in my field kind of like relates to like there's like a couple of things coming up for me, but I think the thing that I do want to speak to is how like there's parts of my lineage that like remember the time where like the moon was an ally as opposed to a vampiric force, and parts of my lineage that are, I guess you can say, like connected to the moon through um, the deity Nephthys, which is interesting because we're talking about nafs and like nefes, which is etymologically super close. This is just how my brain works, and I'm just kind of seeing this like image in my mind's eye of like tribes of people or like groups of people seeding and like taking care of their land and like animals and other people in accordance to these moon cycles, and just imagining a time and place where that like geomagnetic flux is more harmonic, not only on our bodies but on the planet as well. um I'm reading the chat. Am I going to drop some shade? But it's interesting because I feel like there's also conversations about the moon that take place in very like mystical, phantasmal like lenses. But I also know that like this is all very like physical material, like these magnetic shifts and also like the aura of the earth. Like these things are real and they have like when solar flares happen on earth, like I feel it. I am so ungrounded the entire day. Like the left side of my channel feels like inflamed, it hurts. And like the only thing that works and the only thing that stops or like kind of curtails the pain is like doing energy work and kind of visualizing um these cascading like relationships between like my body, the solar plane, the moon, the interplanetary medium. um and so yeah, like this is really juicy stuff. Good tech.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I love that you're speaking to like what I would call like working with like ancestral karma, which gets kicked up by yeah, solar activity, let's say, just to be simple. Because I think that is of integrity, and I feel like a lot of people, you know, like I see a lot of people on X or like threads talking about like the amount that they're suffering or like experiencing pain, I should say,
Mhm.
um, when these things happen. And I think like often it's seen as something which is undesirable, but I feel like for most people the alternative is to like leave their bodies and then just like act out what I'll call like ungrounded timelines, which I think just creates more karma for other people to harmonize. And I think often I would say like for myself, but also my sense is for you, like you're not only harmonizing other like your own ancestral karma, but you're probably harmonizing things that get kicked up in the collective by this activity. But please disagree. Um, but yeah, when I was saying, am I going to drop some shade? I was kind of thinking about how, like, yeah, you know, like a lot of people love the moon, and I guess
Mhm.
like the shade I feel called to drop is that like it makes complete sense to me that some people are working with ancestral karma that would cause them to behave in ways which I'll say like they find positively dysregulating, right? Like it puts them in states of bliss which you could say like unground them and also cause them to behave in ways which may be materially generative for them and for
Mm.
their ancestries, but depletive for life on Earth as a whole, and in particular for humans of other lineages which tend to suffer from the positive dysregulation of other lineages, right? So, like, you know, as a concrete example, let's say like some people like the full moon comes out and they get kind of like blissed out or they go into like bliss states or positive dysregulation states, and maybe they go out and like they dress like all sexy and you know they get a lot of attention on those nights, and then there's probably people who are also out during a full moon who end up getting hooked and end up
Mhm.
like becoming like romantically attached or end up having dreams where they're beset upon by succubi. And it's like that is a vampiric dynamic. And it's not like a symmetrical vampiric dynamic. But I think that um, the polarity which arises from that, where you see some people getting a lot of attention, a lot of people feeling like they're starved of attention, let's say, is a polarity which also serves to cause rupture, which also serves to like produce disorganized energy, which can go on not only to feed the moon, but other demons, which I'll say like dwell in the repository of unhealed ancestral karma.
That was good shade. I didn't personally didn't feel affronted by that one, but I do agree. Yeah, it's interesting because I think that in this other Discord that I'm in or this other server, which I feel bad for saying because like the room is like my main B. But anyways, uh, this other server that I'm in, they were talking about incubi and succubi, and I would love, love, love to like no to feeling bad. Hardly, but I would love to have like a conversation one day about like the metaphysical, and I'd be down to even facilitate it, like the metaphysical anatomy and also like the implications, not to say that the implications are always bad, it could be also fire training ground of like incubi succubi dynamics and what you spoke to, like symmetrical and asymmetrical dynamics, which I think could be very spicy, and also kind of reveal or like take the veil off a little bit from what feels like these social dynamics that we think or feel are like normal, but they're like unconscious, ancestrally driven siphoning dynamics that I think we can totally reroute and totally change. And I think that, yeah, like even just speaking to those dynamics, I think kind of airs them out of any room. Yes. And Nobu says, I feel like I agree with this. I feel like it's only a good training ground if people are prepped to learn. Ashe. If people are not prepped and it's not a training ground, it's a slaughterhouse. Yes. Yes. And I have seen enough accounts and enough platforms like do that where they'll just speak to like one side of these dynamics. They won't kind of like complete that loop. I can't believe I'm about to say this, like complete the loop. But yes, like complete the loop that a lot of this gnosis, at least for me, has come with years of training. Like I did not get this from shout out to Hazrat and Yakam, but it was not in the mysticism of sound and music. I'll tell you that much. It was in life. And in my family, in my friendship dynamics, in my work environments, my closest relationships, like men that were my like partners, live-in partners, you know? And so, yeah, not to say that any sense of anything that anybody's been saying has been glorifying these sort of martial dynamics, but I do, yeah, I think what you said, Nobu's perfect, that the training ground if people are prepared to learn and that they're willing to yeah, take on the fact that yeah, they're gonna have to like learn something or stretch some skills to get to that place of refinement, in my opinion. I want to do a vibe check. How y'all feeling? Who says integrating? And I see Abed is typing. Ahmed says, I'm loving the convo, feeling content, could keep it going, but also contented enough to end it soon. Ashe. Yeah, I know. I'm like, I could definitely keep this going, but I think that's when it's a good sign to kind of end something. Um, enough said. That was so good. Yeah, I do. I feel like a lot of juicy stuff was discussed. Um, yeah, I think next week we're just going to kind of see. I'm gonna take a look at the book real quick. Thank you for providing a really based foundation, Hazy. The next chapter might be named, but I'll keep you guys updated. Either way, feel free to tune in. For those of you guys listening asynchronously and on the podcast, what's up? feel free to tune in next week. Book club happens every Sunday at 8:30 p.m. here in the Breathing Room Radio. And I want to say special thanks to everyone who was here live because gang gang. I'm going to let Craig go. Peace. Maybe. Okay, bye for real, Craig.